Normandy, France, June 12, 1944. 4 days after D-Day, the hedgerows along the Carentan road stand thick and ancient, their earthen walls topped with centuries-old vegetation that transforms the French countryside into a maze of natural fortifications. Inside the commander's cupola of a Panzer IV medium tank, Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker scans the terrain ahead through his periscope, his throat tight with a fear that has nothing to do with enemy armor. He knows the American Sherman tanks are out there somewhere. He knows artillery could fall at any moment. But what makes his hands tremble slightly on the cupola rim is something else entirely. Something smaller, something that could be hiding in any shadow, behind any broken wall, in any fold of ground his tank must pass. Something a single infantryman could carry. Something that has already claimed 3 tanks from his company in the past 36 hours, each one struck not from the front in honest battle between armored giants, but from the side, from concealment, from positions no tank could effectively suppress before the damage was done. His gunner traverses the turret slowly, the electric motor whining in the confined space that suddenly feels more like a metal coffin than a fortress. Every hedgerow is a potential ambush, every ruined building a possible firing position. The tank advances at walking pace, infantry support left behind 200 meters ago when they encountered sniper fire. Becker knows they should wait, knows they should never advance without infantry screening, but the orders are clear and the schedule is already behind. The engine roars as they approach a gap in the hedgerow, the only passage wide enough for the tank's hull. For a moment, everything is green in shadow and the normal sounds of war. Then comes the sound that Becker will never forget, a sound like a massive blowtorch igniting, followed by an impact against the tank's right side that reverberates through the entire hull like the ringing of a steel bell. The shaped-charged warhead of an American M1A1 Bazooka has just struck his Panzer IV sponson armor at a 90-degree angle, and in the fraction of a second it takes for Becker to process what has happened, the war for him and his crew is already over. The story of why German tank crews came to fear the American bazooka more than almost any other infantry weapon begins not in the hedgerows of France, but in the desperate calculations of American ordnance officers in 1941 and early 1942, men who understood that the United States Army had no effective man-portable anti-tank weapon at precisely the moment when German panzers were demonstrating absolute dominance across Europe and North Africa. The Wehrmacht's armored formations had revolutionized warfare through a combination of tank design, tactical doctrine, and operational audacity that left the world's armies scrambling to respond. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 40 days. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all its heavy equipment. Yugoslavia and Greece were crushed. The Soviet Union, despite possessing thousands of tanks, lost millions of men and vast territories in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. In every theater, the sight and sound of approaching armor created panic among infantry who possessed no means to fight back effectively. Anti-tank rifles of the type that had worked against First World War tanks were now nearly useless against modern armor plate. Anti-tank guns were effective but heavy, difficult to conceal, and required crews that were vulnerable to suppressive fire. What was needed was something that ordinary infantrymen could carry into combat, something that could be fired from concealment, something that transformed ground troops from helpless victims into genuine threats to armored vehicles. The British had developed the PIAT, a spring-powered projector that was better than nothing but awkward and short range. The Germans themselves would eventually produce the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, weapons born of the same desperate need. But it was the Americans who would field the first truly successful man-portable rocket launcher in large numbers. And they would do so by combining Swiss shape-charge research with American industrial capacity and a physicist's insight into rocket propulsion. The weapon that would become the bazooka emerged from a collaboration between 2 men who could hardly have been more different. Colonel Leslie Skinner was a career ordnance officer, methodical and practical, who had been working on rocket development at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Dr. Robert Goddard was the pioneering rocket scientist whose work would eventually make space travel possible, but who in 1940 was largely dismissed by the scientific establishment and working in relative obscurity. Skinner had become fascinated with shape-charge warheads, a Swiss invention that used the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy into a narrow jet of superheated metal and gas, capable of penetrating armor far thicker than conventional explosives could breach. The principle was elegant in its physics. A cone-shaped copper liner backed by high explosive would, upon detonation, collapse inward and form a jet that could punch through solid steel like a lance through cloth. The problem was delivery. Shaped charges work best when detonated at a precise standoff distance from the target, and existing delivery methods were all unsatisfactory. Artillery shells arrived too fast and at unpredictable angles. Grenades required a soldier to approach within throwing distance of a tank, which was tantamount to suicide. What Skinner envisioned was a rocket that could carry a shape-charged warhead to the target at a relatively low velocity, allowing the warhead to function properly while keeping the firer at a reasonably safe distance. Goddard's contribution was the rocket motor itself, adapted from his earlier experimental work. In May 1942, working with almost frantic urgency as reports from the Pacific and North Africa grew increasingly grim, Skinner and his team created a prototype by mounting a shape-charged warhead on a rocket motor and firing it from a crude tube. The demonstration for military observers included a shot that penetrated a 3-inch armor plate with contemptuous ease. Within weeks, the weapon was approved for production. Within months, the first examples were being rushed to training centers. The soldiers who first saw it thought the tube looked like the musical instrument used by comedian Bob Burns, and the name stuck. The Bazooka was going to war. The M1 Bazooka that entered service in late 1942 was deceptively simple. A smoothbore steel tube 54 inches long and just under 3 inches in diameter, a wooden shoulder stock and hand grips, a battery-powered electrical firing circuit that sent current through 2 wires to ignite the rocket motor, a simple iron sight. The rocket itself was a smaller tube containing the solid fuel motor, fitted with a warhead that looked like an oversized cone at the front and 4 spring-loaded fins at the rear that popped out after launch to stabilize the projectile in flight. The effective range was perhaps 150 yards on a good day, though skilled crews could occasionally hit targets at 200. The penetration was approximately 3 inches of armor plate under ideal conditions, which was enough to defeat most German tanks of 1942 and 1943 if the hit was square and the armor was homogeneous, rolled plate rather than face-hardened or spaced. The weapon required a 2-man crew, one to carry and fire the launcher, another to load the rockets and carry additional ammunition. Total weight for the launcher was approximately 13 pounds. Each rocket weighed about 3.5 pounds. A soldier could reasonably carry 6 to 8 rounds in addition to his other equipment. Most importantly, the bazooka gave ordinary infantry a weapon that could penetrate a tank's armor from concealment at ranges where the tank's own weapons were often ineffective against individual soldiers. For the first time in the age of mechanized warfare, foot soldiers had a genuine chance in combat against armor, provided they had the courage to get close enough and the discipline to aim for vulnerable spots rather than simply firing at the first glimpse of a target. The bazooka's combat debut came in North Africa in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French Morocco and Algeria. The initial encounters were against Vichy French forces whose tanks were older designs, and the results were promising but not conclusive. It was not until American forces engaged German armor in Tunisia in early 1943 that the weapon's true capabilities and limitations became apparent to both sides. The Africa Corps had expected to face the same poorly equipped American infantry they had heard about in intelligence briefings, troops whose anti-tank capabilities consisted largely of towed guns that could be suppressed by artillery or flanked by fast-moving panzers. The appearance of infantry portable rocket launchers was therefore a tactical surprise, though not an immediately devastating one. Early bazookas frequently failed to penetrate the frontal armor of Panzer IV tanks with their upgraded plating, and they were nearly useless against the front of the new Tiger I heavy tanks that were just beginning to appear in small numbers. German tankers learned that if they could keep American infantry at distance and engage them with machine gun fire, the bazooka teams were vulnerable and relatively easy to suppress. But they also learned something more troubling. When American infantry succeeded in getting to close range, when they managed to work around a flank or strike from a concealed position, the bazooka was devastatingly effective against side and rear armor. A rocket that struck the engine deck could disable a tank's propulsion system or start a fire that forced the crew to evacuate. A hit against the turret ring could jam the traverse mechanism. A strike against the suspension or tracks could immobilize the vehicle, leaving it a stationary target for artillery or air attack. Most importantly, the psychological effect was profound. Tankers who had grown accustomed to near invulnerability against infantry suddenly had to worry about threats from every direction. The true test of the bazooka's effectiveness and the birth of genuine fear among German tank crews came not in the desert's open spaces, but in the close terrain of Italy and the nightmare geography of the Norman hedgerows. Italy was a defender's paradise and an attacker's hell, a vertical landscape of mountains, ridges, river valleys, and ancient stone villages that canalized movement and created countless opportunities for ambush. American infantry learned to use the terrain to their advantage, positioning bazooka teams in second-story windows, behind stone walls, in ravines and defiles where armor had to pass through predictable choke points. The Germans learned that every Italian village was a potential death trap, every mountain pass a killing ground. Tanks that had dominated the steppes of Russia and the sands of Libya found themselves confined to narrow roads with no room to maneuver, advancing slowly past buildings whose windows might conceal a waiting rocket launcher. The effective engagement range of a bazooka in such terrain was often less than 50 yards, which was terrifying for tankers who had come to rely on standoff distance as their primary defense against infantry. At 50 yards, a tank's machine guns were most effective, but so was a shaped charge warhead, and the tanker's armor was static while the infantryman's concealment was nearly absolute until the moment of firing. The muzzle blast of a bazooka was highly visible, creating a backblast of flame and dust that instantly revealed the firer's position. But by then, the rocket was already in flight, and a 2-second time of flight at close range left little opportunity for a tank crew to react. German doctrine began to change. Tanks that had once advanced aggressively now moved cautiously. Infantry support became not merely advisable, but absolutely essential. Speed, which had been the Panzer force's greatest tactical advantage, was increasingly sacrificed for security. Normandy in the summer of 1944 presented conditions that made the bazooka even more fearsome than it had been in Italy. The bocage country of Normandy is agricultural land divided by hedgerows called hays, ancient earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation that create field boundaries often 10 or 12 feet high. Roads run between these walls of earth and roots, creating sunken lanes that are effectively trenches. Visibility is measured in yards rather than miles. A tank commander cannot see what lies beyond the next hedgerow until his vehicle pushes through it, and breaking through the thick vegetation and embedded root systems requires either special equipment or a vulnerable moment of slow movement. American infantry found this terrain ideally suited to bazooka tactics. Teams would wait in hedgerows flanking a sunken lane, allowing German armor to pass within 20 or 30 yards before firing at side armor that was typically thinner than frontal protection. Other teams would position themselves to cover approaches to villages or crossroads, creating overlapping fields of fire that meant a tank attempting to bypass one position would expose itself to another. The M9A1 bazooka that was now in service had addressed many of the early model's deficiencies, featuring a two-piece design that could be broken down for easier transport and improved electrical connections that reduced misfires. Some teams carried the newer M20 Super Bazooka being introduced in limited numbers, a larger weapon with a 60mm rocket that offered improved penetration. But even the original M1A1 was effective enough in the hedgerows where engagement ranges were so short and opportunities to strike vulnerable aspects were so numerous. What made the bazooka particularly terrifying from the German perspective was not any single technical specification, but rather the way it changed the fundamental nature of armored warfare. For nearly 5 years, German tank crews had enjoyed a psychological advantage over most infantry. The sound of approaching armor was the sound of approaching doom for foot soldiers armed with rifles and hand grenades. Tank crews felt protected, powerful, confident in their steel shells. That psychological dominance was shattered by the proliferation of man-portable anti-tank weapons. Suddenly, every infantryman was a potential tank killer. Every shadow might conceal a threat. Every patch of vegetation might hide a bazooka team. The constant mental strain of this awareness wore on crews in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Veterans of the Eastern Front spoke of the terror of Soviet infantry attack waves, the nightmare of being swarmed by soldiers willing to sacrifice themselves to place magnetic mines or Molotov cocktails. But the Americans brought a different kind of fear, one based not on fanatical charges, but on patient, methodical tactics that used concealment and combined arms to get rocket teams into position. Bazooka operators were trained to work in coordination with rifles and machine guns that would pin down supporting infantry, to use smoke for concealment, to fire at vulnerable points rather than simply aiming for center mass. They were also trained to exfiltrate quickly after firing, moving to alternate positions before the enemy could bring suppressive fire to bear. This made them difficult to counterattack and meant that even if one shot missed or failed to penetrate, subsequent shots might come from different angles. The German response to the bazooka threat evolved through several phases. Initially, there was a tendency to dismiss American infantry as inexperienced and poorly motivated compared to Wehrmacht veterans, and to attribute bazooka successes to luck rather than skill. This comfortable assessment did not survive contact with reality for long. After-action reports from battalion and regiment commanders began noting the frequency with which tanks were being disabled or destroyed by infantry-carried rockets, and tactical bulletins stressed the absolute necessity of infantry support for armor operating in close terrain. Panzer crews began adding improvised armor in the form of track links, spare wheels, and sandbags to their vehicles' sides, hoping that these additions would detonate shape-charged warheads prematurely or provide additional protection. Such measures had mixed results at best and added weight that strained already overtaxed suspensions and drivetrains. More effectively, German tankers adopted new tactical procedures. Movement through potential ambush terrain was done at higher speed when possible, reducing the window of opportunity for bazooka teams. When speed was impossible, tanks moved in closer cooperation with infantry who would clear suspected positions before armor advanced. Tank commanders became obsessive about maintaining all-around security, constantly scanning for threats rather than focusing primarily on the direction of advance. Smoke grenades and smoke shells were used more liberally to screen movements through dangerous areas. Most tellingly, the German army accelerated development and production of its own shape-charged infantry weapons. The Panzer, which was essentially a direct copy of the American bazooka, scaled up to 88 millimeters, entered service in 1943. The Panzerfaust, a simpler single-shot weapon with a recoilless design, began appearing in large numbers in 1944. These weapons were issued to German infantry facing Soviet, British, and American armor, and their widespread deployment was a clear admission that the bazooka concept was sound and that infantry portable anti-armor capability was now a necessary part of modern warfare. The accounts of individual German tank crewmen provide insight into the psychological dimension of the bazooka threat that statistics alone cannot capture. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, commander of a Panther tank company in Normandy, wrote in his diary after the war about the sensation of operating in the hedgerows. "We were blind giants among thousands of hidden enemies. Every meter of advance required a decision between speed and caution, and both carried mortal risk. The sound of a bazooka firing is distinctive, a rushing roar that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. In the 2 seconds between hearing that sound and the impact, you have time to understand that you may be about to die, but no time to do anything about it. My gunner was hit by a spall when a rocket struck near the gun mantlet. The warhead did not fully penetrate, but fragments of the inner armor face broke off and tore through his right arm and chest. He survived but never returned to duty. After that, every time we entered a village or approached a hedgerow gap, I saw his face in my mind." Another account from Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, a Panzer IV driver, describes the moment his tank was hit. "The impact felt like being inside a bell when it is struck. The sound was beyond anything I had experienced in 2 years of combat. Our tank commander thought we had been hit by a large-caliber anti-tank gun and ordered immediate withdrawal, but the engine would not respond. We later learned that the rocket had struck the engine deck and destroyed the cooling system and fuel pump. We abandoned the vehicle under small arms fire, and 3 of us made it back to our lines. The loader was shot during the evacuation and died before we could get him to an aid station. That tank had survived direct hits from Soviet anti-tank guns in Russia. It had gone through the entire Kharkov offensive without serious damage, but a single rocket fired by an American soldier we never even saw killed it in an instant. The technical effectiveness of the bazooka against different types of German armor varied considerably, and this variation is important for understanding both the weapon's genuine capabilities and the psychological effect that sometimes exceeded its actual lethality. Against early Panzer, 4 models with 50 millimeters of side armor, the bazooka was extremely effective, capable of penetration at almost any impact angle. Against Panther tanks with 40 millimeters of side armor, but very high-quality steel, penetration was more variable depending on range and angle, but still frequently successful. Against Tiger I and Tiger II, heavy tanks with 80 to 100 millimeters of side armor, the standard bazooka often failed to achieve complete penetration, though it could still damage external equipment, tracks, and vision devices. However, the distinction between complete penetration and mission kill was often academic from the crew's perspective. A tank with damaged tracks was immobilized and would likely be lost to artillery or air attack, even if the crew survived the initial hit. A tank with a damaged engine could not retreat and would often be abandoned. A tank with destroyed optics was effectively blind and helpless. Even hits that did not penetrate the main armor could cause spalling on the interior surface, sending metal fragments ricocheting around the crew compartment with potentially lethal results. The shaped charged jet itself, when it achieved penetration, was devastatingly effective inside the confined space of a tank's interior, destroying equipment, igniting ammunition, and killing or wounding crew members. Moreover, the effect of near misses and non-penetrating hits on crew morale cannot be overstated. Knowing that the enemy possessed a weapon that could hurt you was almost as psychologically damaging as being hurt, and the cumulative effect of multiple encounters, even those that ended without serious damage, created a baseline level of stress and fear that degraded crew performance and unit cohesion. American infantry tactics for employing the bazooka evolved considerably as the war progressed and combat experience accumulated. In the initial training manuals, the weapon was portrayed almost as a sort of anti-tank sniper rifle, with individual 2-man teams engaging armor at maximum possible range. Combat experience quickly revealed that this approach was ineffective against alert, well-trained tank crews who could suppress visible positions with machine gun fire and call for artillery support. By late 1943 and into 1944, American doctrine emphasized the use of multiple bazooka teams operating in coordination, creating crossfires that gave armor no safe aspect to present. Teams were trained to identify and prioritize vulnerable components: engine compartments, ammunition stowage areas in the rear, turret rings, vision devices, and track assemblies. They were taught to be patient, to allow tanks to pass their position in order to achieve flank or rear shots, rather than taking low-probability frontal shots that would reveal their position without achieving damage. Combined arms integration became crucial. Riflemen and machine gunners would fix the enemy infantry, while bazooka teams maneuvered. Mortars would lay smoke to cover team movement or to blind tank commanders. Sometimes teams would deliberately draw armor into prepared kill zones where multiple launchers could engage simultaneously. In urban combat, multi-story buildings allowed teams to fire down onto the thin top armor of tanks, while basements and ground floor positions offered concealment and protection until the moment of firing. The bravery required to operate a bazooka in combat was considerable. The weapon's backblast meant it could not be fired from enclosed spaces without risking injury to the crew. The launcher had to be fired from the shoulder, requiring the operator to expose himself to aim. The flight time of the rocket meant there was no instant feedback, and watching a rocket fly toward a target while standing in the open was an exercise in enforced courage. Teams that missed or failed to disable their target often had only seconds to abandon their position before receiving massive return fire. The evolution of the bazooka itself during the war years reflected both American industrial capacity and the responsiveness of ordnance developers to field reports. The M1A1 variant introduced in late 1943 featured improved sights and electrical connections, addressing the most common causes of misfires and misses. The M9 and M9A1 variants introduced a two-piece design that broke the launcher into two sections that could be connected with a coupling, making the weapon easier to transport through dense vegetation or into buildings. The improved design also featured a stronger tube that was safer to fire and reduced the risk of tube failure. The M20 Super Bazooka, introduced near the end of the war in Europe and seeing more extensive use in the Pacific and Korea, used a larger 60-millimeter rocket with significantly improved penetration and range, addressing the capability gap that had emerged as German armor grew thicker. The rockets themselves evolved as well. Improved shaped charge liner designs, better quality explosive, and more consistent manufacturing all contributed to more reliable penetration. Yet even with these improvements, the bazooka remained a weapon that required courage and skill to employ effectively. It was not a wonder weapon. It was not a guaranteed tank killer. What it was, and what made it so feared, was a leveling weapon that gave infantry a fighting chance against armor and that introduced uncertainty into every tactical situation involving tanks operating near foot soldiers. The broader strategic and tactical implications of the bazooka's effectiveness rippled through both American and German military planning. For the Americans, the weapon justified tactical approaches that maximized its advantages. Infantry became more willing to hold positions against armor, knowing they had some means of defense. Armor-infantry cooperation improved as tank crews learned to rely on infantry for close-range security, while infantry relied on tanks for mobile firepower and breakthrough capability. Urban combat doctrine evolved to emphasize the use of bazooka teams in combination with tank destroyers and supporting artillery. For the Germans, the implications were more troubling. The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine around mobile armored warfare, with tanks leading rapid advances that exploited breakthroughs and encircled enemy forces. That doctrine required tanks to move quickly and aggressively, often ahead of supporting infantry. The proliferation of effective man-portable anti-tank weapons made such tactics increasingly costly. Tanks had to slow down, had to wait for infantry support, had to treat every advance through close terrain as a deliberate operation requiring careful coordination. This slowed the operational tempo of German armored formations at exactly the time when speed was most crucial. As the Wehrmacht faced multiple fronts and lacked the resources to afford protracted battles of attrition, the need to defend against bazooka attacks also contributed to the increasing complexity and weight of German tank designs, as designers added armor and protective systems that made tanks more survivable but less reliable and more difficult to produce in quantity. The statistical record of bazooka effectiveness provides some quantitative support for the qualitative accounts of its impact, though battlefield statistics are notoriously difficult to verify and interpret. American Army records credit the bazooka with hundreds of tank and armored vehicle kills throughout the European and Pacific theaters, though the exact numbers vary depending on how one counts shared kills with other weapons and whether one includes vehicles abandoned after damage versus those destroyed outright. German loss reports are less helpful for assessing specific weapon effectiveness since they rarely distinguish between losses to different types of anti-tank weapons unless the circumstances were unambiguous. What is clear from unit histories and after-action reports is that infantry portable anti-tank weapons accounted for a significant percentage of German armor losses in close terrain, and that the bazooka was the most common such weapon in American service. Equally telling is the frequency with which German tactical reports and training bulletins mention the threat of American rocket launchers and the need for countermeasures. When an enemy takes a weapon seriously enough to change doctrine and develop countermeasures, that weapon is achieving strategic effect regardless of the precise number of kills it accumulates. The bazooka forced the Germans to divert resources, adjust tactics, and accept operational constraints that limited their freedom of action. That is a measure of effectiveness that transcends simple statistics. The fear that German tank crews felt toward the bazooka was, in the end, a rational response to a genuine threat. But it was also more than that. It represented a psychological shift in armored warfare, a recognition that the age of tank invincibility was over. The heavily armored vehicles that had seemed like mechanical gods in 1939 and 1940 were by 1944 revealed as powerful but vulnerable weapon systems that required careful employment and comprehensive support to survive. The bazooka was not uniquely responsible for this shift. Improvements in anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, anti-tank mines, and ground attack aircraft all contributed, but it was perhaps the most visible and personal manifestation of the change. Every German tank commander who saw a bazooka team in action, who heard the distinctive roar of a rocket launch, who felt the impact of a shape-charged warhead against his vehicle's hull, understood viscerally that the tactical environment had changed. The tank was no longer a guarantee of survival and dominance. It was simply another weapon, effective in certain circumstances and vulnerable in others, and its crew could die as easily as any infantryman if they made a mistake or encountered a skilled and courageous opponent. That knowledge, that constant awareness of vulnerability, created a stress that accumulated over time and that no amount of armor plate could shield against. Combat veterans of armored units from all armies speak of the particular strain of tank warfare, the noise, the confinement, the knowledge that a hit could mean fire or explosion. And the bazooka added another layer to that strain. It was the weapon in the shadows, the threat from unexpected directions, the reminder that safety was an illusion and that every advance might be your last. The legacy of the bazooka extended well beyond the Second World War and continues to influence military technology and tactics into the present century. The weapon established the shape-charged rocket launcher as a standard component of infantry anti-armor capability for armies worldwide. Post-war developments produced increasingly sophisticated descendants. The American M20 Super Bazooka gave way to the M72 LAW light anti-tank weapon, which in turn was supplemented by wire-guided missiles like the TOW, and eventually by fire-and-forget systems with advanced guidance and much greater range. The Soviet Union developed the RPG family of weapons, beginning with the RPG-2 and progressing through the widely proliferated RPG-7 that remains in service globally more than 60 years after its introduction. These weapons became so ubiquitous that they fundamentally shaped how armies thought about armored vehicle design, leading to developments like explosive reactive armor, composite armor systems, active protection systems, and the overall concept of survivability as a multi-layered approach rather than simply adding more steel plate. The tactical lessons of bazooka employment, combined arms integration, use of terrain for concealment, targeting of vulnerable points rather than strongest armor, coordination of multiple firing positions, became foundational principles taught in military academies and practiced in training exercises. The psychological impact, the understanding that infantry could threaten armor under the right circumstances, influenced everything from unit organization to operational planning to the doctrine of combined arms warfare that remains dominant in modern military thought. For the men who faced bazookas in combat, the memories remained vivid decades after the war ended. In the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began conducting systematic oral history interviews with Wehrmacht veterans, the bazooka appeared frequently in their accounts, often described with a mixture of respect and residual fear. One Panther tank commander, speaking more than 30 years after the war, recalled, "Of all the weapons we faced, the Russian 76mm guns, the British 17-pounder, the American 90mm tank destroyer guns, none created the same feeling as the bazooka. The big guns were dangerous, but they were predictable. You could see them. You knew where they were likely to be positioned. You could maneuver against them or call for artillery support. The bazooka could be anywhere. A single soldier in a ditch, two men in a cellar, a team hidden in trees. You never knew until the rocket was already flying toward you, and by then it was too late to do anything but hope it missed or hope your armor would hold." That feeling of being constantly watched, constantly vulnerable, was exhausting in a way that actual combat often was not. I would rather have fought 10 battles against Russian tanks than drive through one French village where I knew bazooka teams might be waiting. Another veteran, who had served as a loader in a Panzer IV, described the moment his tank was penetrated by a bazooka in a Norman hedgerow. "The rocket hit us on the left side, below the turret ring. I was sitting on the right side, and the jet missed me by perhaps 50 centimeters. Our radio man was not so lucky. The jet struck him in the torso and killed him instantly. The interior filled with smoke and fumes. We bailed out through the turret hatches while the tank was still rolling forward. The Americans must have thought we were trying to escape because they opened fire with small arms and we had to take cover behind the tank. Eventually, we were taken prisoner. Later, when I saw what a bazooka warhead looked like and how small the launcher was, I was amazed that something so simple could destroy a 25-ton tank. But it did, and that is what we feared. Not the weapon itself, but the knowledge that it could be anywhere, and that our armor was not protection enough. The infantry soldiers who carried bazookas into combat had their own perspective on the weapon, one that mixed appreciation for its capability with frustration at its limitations and acute awareness of the courage required to use it effectively. Private First Class John Richardson, who operated a bazooka in the 29th Infantry Division during the Normandy campaign, recalled in a post-war interview, "Training with the bazooka was straightforward enough. You learned how to load it, how to check the electrical connection, how to aim using the simple sights. They told us the effective range was 150 yards, but in actual combat I never fired at anything beyond about 70 yards and most of my shots were at 50 yards or less. At that range you couldn't miss the target, but you also couldn't afford to miss because you might not get a second shot. The backblast when you fired was impressive, a huge gout of flame and smoke that told everyone within 200 yards exactly where you were. My loader and I had a routine. I would fire, he would immediately load another round, and then we would both move to a different position before the Germans could put fire on our original location. We knocked out 2 tanks in Normandy and damaged a third. Each time I remember the feeling of satisfaction mixed with sheer terror. Satisfaction because we had hurt the enemy. Terror because we were now the focus of a lot of angry soldiers with much bigger guns than ours. I saw bazooka teams that were not fast enough or lucky enough. A tank's machine gun or a mortar round would catch them before they could exfiltrate, and that was the end. It took a particular kind of courage to stand up with a bazooka when there was a tank 40 yards away. You had to believe you would survive long enough to make the shot count, and you had to be willing to do it even when you were not entirely sure you would. The technical limitations of the bazooka were real and significant, and acknowledging them is essential to understanding why the weapon was feared rather than why it was universally effective. The short range meant that teams had to allow tanks to approach very close, which required iron nerve and meant that any premature detection could be fatal. The relatively low velocity of the rocket, around 300 feet per second, meant that moving targets were difficult to hit at any range, and that even stationary targets could be missed by inexperienced crews or by anyone firing in high wind or adverse conditions. The electrical firing system was vulnerable to moisture, weak batteries, and broken connections, leading to misfires that could occur at the worst possible moment. The penetration, while adequate against most German armor when hitting side or rear aspects, was marginal against late-war heavy tanks and sometimes failed due to variations in armor quality or warhead function. The backblast signature made concealment after firing nearly impossible. The weight of the launcher and a combat load of rockets, when added to a soldier's other equipment, was substantial and exhausting to carry over distance. Despite these limitations, or perhaps partly because of them, the bazooka achieved its strategic purpose. It did not need to kill every tank it engaged. It merely needed to be present in sufficient numbers and employed with sufficient skill to force enemy armor to operate more cautiously, more slowly, and with greater support requirements. It needed to create uncertainty in the minds of tank commanders to make them question whether the next advance would be their last. In this, the bazooka succeeded completely. The final assessment of why German tank crews feared the bazooka more than almost any other infantry weapon must account for multiple factors that combined to create a threat profile unlike that of any other anti-armor system of the era. The bazooka was man-portable, which meant it could appear anywhere infantry could go, which was virtually anywhere. It was concealable, which meant that its presence could not be determined by visual reconnaissance, as could the presence of towed anti-tank guns with their distinctive profiles. It could be fired from enclosed or partially enclosed positions, giving the operator some protection that was not available to rifle grenadiers or those employing contact weapons like magnetic mines. It had sufficient penetration to be effective against the armor of most German vehicles when fired at vulnerable aspects, which meant that tactical employment rather than raw power was the determining factor in success. It created a distinctive and psychologically unnerving sound when fired, a roaring whoosh that tankers learned to recognize and dread. It could be employed by ordinary infantry soldiers with relatively modest training, which meant that American units could field multiple bazooka teams per company, creating overlapping fields of fire and multiple simultaneous threats. It represented a reversal of the normal power relationship between armor and infantry, allowing foot soldiers to genuinely threaten vehicles that outweighed them by tons and that mounted weapons of vastly greater firepower. Most fundamentally, it introduced an element of uncertainty into every tactical situation involving armor operating in close terrain, an uncertainty that could not be resolved through better armor, better guns, or better tactics, but only through the risky and time-consuming process of thorough infantry reconnaissance and close combined arms cooperation. The intersection of technological capability, tactical employment, and psychological effect created a weapon system whose impact exceeded what might be predicted from its specifications alone. This is a common pattern in military history. Weapons that force an enemy to change behavior, that create disproportionate concern relative to their actual lethality, that introduce new vulnerabilities into previously secure systems, often prove more strategically significant than weapons with higher raw performance, but more predictable effects. The bazooka was such a weapon. It did not win the war. It did not even account for the majority of German armor losses, but it changed how armored warfare was conducted in close terrain. It imposed tactical and operational constraints on enemy commanders, and it created a psychological burden that accumulated over months of combat until it became a defining element of the tank crew experience. In the final accounting, when veteran German tankers gathered in the decades after the war to share their memories, and when historians asked what they had feared most, the bazooka appeared again and again in their answers. Not the massive Soviet anti-tank guns that could destroy a tank at 1,000 meters, not the swarms of ground attack aircraft that dominated the skies, not the artillery that fell like mechanical rain, but the small tube that an infantry soldier could carry, that could be hiding behind the next wall or in the next hedgerow, that could reach out from the shadows and turn a steel fortress into a steel tomb in the space of a heartbeat. That was the weapon they feared because it was the weapon they could not predict, could not avoid, and could not always survive. The bazooka had given ordinary soldiers the power to kill giants, and the giants had learned to be afraid. Normandy, France, June 12, 1944. Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker survived the war. His tank did not. He spent the remainder of the conflict as a prisoner, which he later described as a stroke of profound luck. The bazooka that struck his panzer for that afternoon in the hedgerows had penetrated the sponson armor and destroyed the radio equipment, wounded one crew member, and convinced Becker that remaining in the tank was suicide. He and his crew surrendered to the American infantry who emerged from concealment after the strike. In his memoirs written in the 1970s, he devoted an entire chapter to that single day and to the weapon that ended his war. I have been asked many times, and he wrote, what it was like to fight in a tank and whether I was afraid. The truth is that I was often afraid, but the fear was manageable because it was predictable. I knew what Soviet tanks could do. I knew what anti-tank guns could do. I knew the risks and I knew the tactics. But the bazooka was different. It turned every advance into a gamble. It made safety impossible. It meant that courage alone was not enough, that even perfect tactics could not guarantee survival. In the end, I think that is what we feared most. Not death itself, which is always present in war, but the knowledge that death could come at any moment from any direction, despite everything we did to prevent it. That is the legacy of the bazooka, and it is why we remembered it long after the guns fell silent.